The history of the reception of John Philoponus' commentary on Aristotle's physics must be understood within the broader context of the recovery of ancient and late ancient texts that took place in Latin Europe from the early 15th century onward. Philoponus' extensive body of work, comprising writings on grammar, philosophy, theology, as well as, of course, Aristotelian exegesis, was only partially known in the Latin Middle Ages. In fact, medieval scholars had direct access only to a fragment of his commentary on Book 3 of Aristotle's De Anima, chapters 4 to 8, which was translated into Latin by William of Merbeke in the 13th century. And here you have one of the manuscript witnesses to this translation. This is a beautifully decorated specimen from the Vatican Library, and you can see the title here, Johannes Grammaticus Super Tertium De Anima. This is all that was known by Philoponus during the Middle Ages. For the rest of Philoponus' writings, Latin scholastics possessed only fragmentary and indirect knowledge, usually mediated through Arabic authors available in Latin translation, such as Avicenna and Averroes, most notably, but also others. In terms of his commentary on the physics, Philoponus certainly wrote a complete commentary, covering all 8 books of the treatise. We know this from the commentary on the same work by his contemporary and rival, Simplicius, who discusses Philoponus' commentary at great length in his exegesis, making very precise references to the totality of Philoponus' commentary. However, of the 8 books of Philoponus' commentary, the last 4 appear to have been lost relatively early. Already by the 10th century, it becomes difficult to find traces of them in Byzantine authors, although this issue would deserve further investigation, and I recently published a survey of the presence and circulation of Philoponus' natural philosophy writings in the Greek medieval context, and I showed that on the one hand, Philoponus' works were widely circulated in the Greek medieval context, but on the other, in terms of his commentary on Aristotle's physics, it is clear that from as early as the 10th century, Greek medieval scholars had no direct access to the last 4 books. This fact, as we shall see, became crucial for the later European reception of the work. The recovery and reconstitution of the lost books of the commentary would become a central goal for several 16th century intellectuals, scholars, bibliophiles, publishers, who attempted with different methods and results to reconstitute a text that quickly proved valuable as a source of arguments for reconsidering some of the principles of Aristotelian physics. During my research so far, I was able to reconstruct the extant manuscript tradition of Philoponus' commentary. In Greek, I shall say immediately that there are no known witnesses to the Latin translation. The Latin version is only available in the prints. Thanks to this work, which have been undertaken during the last few years, it was possible to add to the list of witnesses provided by Vitelli in his critical edition of Philoponus' work. So Philoponus' commentary on the physics was, the Greek text, of course, was edited by the great Italian philologist Girolamo Vitelli in the 19th century within the Berlin project of the Commentari in Aristotelem Greek et Byzantina. This is a monument of scholarship. It is published in 2 volumes, appeared respectively in 1887 and 1888. But of course, working in the late 19th century, Vitelli did not possess all the resources and tools that are available to us today. So it was possible to add to the list of manuscript witnesses. And here you have what I consider to be all the, to the best of my knowledge, all the manuscript witnesses of Philoponus commentary in Greek. Again, those highlighted in yellow are the manuscripts that came out during my research. So those manuscripts were not known to Vitelli. Let me just say straight away that none of these manuscripts provide like a new reading, a significant reading from an anecdotic point of view that would force us to redo the edition. Vitelli's edition is still very authoritative and reliable. So they're not important from an anecdotic point of view, but they're important, I think, from an historical point of view, because they show that the circulation of this work was even greater than assumed before. I'm not going to discuss every single item, fortunately for you. A study in which I survey all the available manuscript evidence is about to be published within an edited volume, so I will leave this aspect aside. But let me just say a couple of things that prove important for our discussion on the printed fortune of the text. To begin with, during my research, it was possible to identify in the manuscript Laurentiano Plutus 87-6 the codex that likely ushered Philoponus' commentary into the Latin European world. The manuscript, which is known to have belonged to the Italian humanist Niccolò Niccoli, presents the following annotation on the bas de page of one of the final folios. And I have focusing on it here. It says, as you can see, Anno Domini millesimo quadricentesimo decimo quinto mensis septembris, ego presbyter Christophorus de Bondelmontibus de Florentia emi unc librum in Monte Iucta in monasterio Sancti Salvatoris insule Crete ai perperis undecim. So this manuscript was bought by Cristoforo Buondelmonti in Crete, and we have also a precise date, September the 5th, 1415. Born in Florence to a noble and wealthy family, Buondelmonti was taught Greek by the Italian scholar Guarino da Verona and received further education from Niccolò Niccoli himself. From 1414 until his death in 1430, Buondelmonti traveled extensively through the lands of ancient Greece and Constantinople, playing a pioneering role in the promotion of first-hand knowledge of Greece and its antiquities throughout Western Europe. He collaborated with Niccoli on the composition of several works on the Aegean Islands and served as Niccoli's book hunter in the area, contributing significantly to the construction of Niccoli's conspicuous collection of Greek books. And here you can see on the left side his Descriptio Insulae Crete, an exemplar from a manuscript housed at the Vatican Library. And on the right side, you have a gem. This is an image included in the Liber Insularium Archipelagi. It's from a manuscript held at the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, of course. And this is the only known image of Constantinople dating prior to the Ottoman conquest. And it was done by Buondelmonti himself. In the years 1414-1417, Buondelmonti was in Crete, working on his Descriptio Insulae Crete, the work on the left side of the slide, which is a historical geographical account of the island he dedicated to Niccoli himself. We know that after completing it, he shipped the work to Nicoli in 1417, along with several Greek codices purchased there at Nicoli's request. The Philoponus Codex that we just saw was, in all likelihood, included in the shipment. If this scenario holds true, and I think it does, and if the extant manuscript evidence is of an indication here, then we might have what seems to be a precise date for the arrival of Philoponus' commentary to Latin Europe, to Italy in this case. This codex is also important from a textual standpoint, for it served as the basis for the critical edition of Book 4 prepared by Vitelli. So he actually relied on this very manuscript for his edition of Book 4 of Philoponus' commentary. The second thing to be said about the manuscript tradition is that we can identify two main phases in the reception history of Philoponus' work. An earlier phase, covering more or less the 15th century, in which most of the manuscripts were recovered or copied thanks to the effort of Italian humanists, we just saw Buondelmonti and Nicoli, and Byzantine intellectuals such as Bessarion, Pletho, Argyropoulos, and others. And a later phase, spanning the entire 16th century and even extending into the 17th, involves a group of manuscripts acquired or commissioned by European scholars and bibliophiles. In many cases, this phase postdates both the first printed edition of the Greek text in 1535 and the first Latin translation published in 1539. We are going to see them in a bit. A common feature of this second group of manuscripts is that they preserve, most of them, preserve fragments of the 4 lost books of Philoponus' commentary, fragments that were never published in print until Vitelli's modern critical edition. And here you have a few examples of them. For example, in the early decades of the 16th century, the Neapolitan physician Ambrogio Leone copied or had copied fragments of Book 5 to 8. In the 1540s, Guillaume Pélissier, the French ambassador to Venice from 1539 to 1542, acquired for the French king a manuscript containing scholia by Philoponus on Book 8 of the Physics. And this is the very manuscript you have on the left side of the slide. So you have Aristotle's text on the center of the page and then all the running scholia on the margins. Finally, in the 1570s, Cardinal Guglielmo Sirleto, soon to become prefect of the Vatican Library, commissioned the Dutch humanist Arnaud Delaine to produce a copy of the available fragments of Book 8 for his personal collection of Greek manuscripts. And this is the Vatican manuscript you have on the center of the slide, Ottoboniano Grecus 32. So, the latest phase of the manuscript tradition, the one that comes after the publication in print of the Greek text and the Latin translation, the latest phase of the manuscript circulation seems to reflect a broader intellectual project, namely an effort by prominent scholars to recover the lost books of Philoponus' commentary. This project certainly reflects the philological and antiquarian interests of Renaissance scholars. However, it must also be understood in light of the impact that the first 4 books of the commentary had already begun to exert in the early 16th century. Already in 1520, that is well before the printed Greek edition or the Latin version appeared, authors with an anti-Aristotelian orientation, such as Gianfrancesco Pico della Mirandola, were making extensive use of Philoponus' commentary to challenge key concepts of Aristotelian physics, including space, void, and matter. And here you have a passage from a chapter or from book 6 of Gianfrancesco's Examen Vanitatis Doctrinae Gentium, and you can read the title Loci Definitionem ab Aristotele Traditam a Philopono et alis impugnari. So the definition of place, space that was formulated by Aristotle was questioned by Philoponus and others. Et quem ipse reprobat spatii videlicet trineque dimensionis aperte defendit. And Philoponus defends one of the alternatives that Aristotle had rejected, namely that space is a three-dimensional entity. So even before the Greek text was edited and translated, scholars were making extensive use of Philoponus in order to question, to challenge principles of Aristotelian physics in this case. So we must imagine that the impact of Philoponus was significant from the very beginning. And this is not the case for, any work. The attempt to reconstruct the complete commentary, therefore, also served a broader intellectual aim, making fully accessible a work that could play a significant role in the gradual dismantling of Aristotelian natural philosophy. Coming to the prince. The Editio Princeps of the Greek text was printed in Venice by Bartolomeo Zanetti in 1535. The editor of the text, Vittore Trincavelli, relied on the Marcianus Grecus Z230 for the edition of books 1 to 3 and the digression on Voigt. And he relied on Nicoli's manuscript, the one we saw earlier, for the rest of book 4, which, interestingly, is pretty much what Vitelli would do 3.5 centuries later. While for book 4, he made use of an apograph of Nicoli's Codex, now lost, for the first 3 books, it is sure that the typesetters of Trincavelli had the very Marciana manuscript, not a copy, in their hands, for the Codex presents clear traces of typographic work. The work was first translated into Latin by Guglielmo Doroteo and printed in Venice by Ottaviano Scoto in 1539. That is 4 years after the Greek text was printed. We don't know much about the man. We know that he came from the city of Venice or the surrounding area, for the titles of the works he edited present him as Guglielmus Dorotheus Venetus. We know that he was a member of the Augustinian order and that was trained as a classicist. In addition to Philoponus' commentary on the physics, he translated his commentary on the prior analytics, Alexander of Aphrodisias' commentaries on the topics and sophistical refutations, and Simplicius' commentary on the categories. In the preface, Doroteo presents his work with great modesty. All translations from the Latin are mine. He says, for I didn't do this in order to win your favor or to derive some benefit from your judgment, since I have produced nothing of my own so far that I deem worthy of publication. Yet I am eager to promise that these translations, prepared in this manner at the discretion of the printers, will be brought to light in the Latin language. The dependence of Doroteo's translation on Trincavelli's edition of the Greek text has been confirmed by Vitelli on the basis of a close comparison between the two, so that there is no point here in offering examples of mistakes in the Greek that affected the Latin version. So we saw that Doroteo basically took the printed edition and translated pretty much verbum ad verbum from it. Doroteo's version proved quite successful. It was reprinted 4 times up until 1554. So we have 5 editions of this version. Then in 1558, a new translation came out. It was authored by Giovanni Battista Rasario, a scholar and physician from Novara, and printed in Venice by Girolamo Scoto. The translation is prefaced by a dedicatory letter to the Venetian patrician and diplomat Francesco Badoer, in which Rasario harshly criticizes the version made by his predecessor, Doroteo. And I'm sorry for the ugly slide, but I promise it's going to be fun. This is a passage from the dedication, which I'm now going to read. It says, thus, during these months in which I have been able to take a break from public duties while waiting for the heat to subside, I resolved to read those books of Aristotle that deal with the principles and causes of natural things. My goal was that by laying this foundation and recalling to mind what is contained in those books, I might more easily and without any error proceed to the rest of the works. But see what I have done. I did not consider this study to be fruitful for myself unless some benefit might also flow from it to others. For since many people had already informed me that the commentaries John the Grammarian wrote on the first 4 books were so poorly translated that scholars could barely understand much of them, I thought it worth undertaking the task, useful in my opinion for those ignorant of the Greek language, though not necessary for myself, to compare the translation with the Greek manuscripts, cum Graecis, and correct it as much as possible. Indeed, I carried out this task diligently, but with such great effort and difficulty that, although I was driven by a remarkable enthusiasm for philosophy, the delight I derived from Aristotle's ideas and my intense eagerness could scarcely alleviate, even in part, the frustration and disgust, offensione matque fastidium, I felt from grappling with that translation. The translator, being utterly ineptissimus, seemed to have undertaken the task only to impress his readers by adding this work to his own catalogue. But he was all the more unlearned, since he showed himself to be unable to grasp either the words or the meaning. As a result, beyond the wretched and clumsy style in which he is a master, in quo ille regnat, everything was so distorted that I was almost dissuaded from continuing with my plan and complete it. However, public benefit triumphed over my personal discomfort, sed vicit publica utilitas privatam molestiam. But I could not accomplish what I had hoped to do, namely to retranslate the commentaries entirely into Latin, de integro in Latinam linguam convertere, which I had indeed intended. But other studies demanded my time, drawing me toward oratory rather than writing. Therefore, I was compelled to turn to different matters. Rasario's assessment of his predecessor's work is indeed very harsh, if not brutal. As I'm going to show, it is totally unjustified too. In fact, a comparison between Doroteo's and Rasario's translations immediately shows that Rasario could not be more deceitful when claiming that he provided, if not a retranslation proper, at least a substantially different version, one that also benefited from the examination of previously overlooked manuscripts. His versions, and here you have the same passage in the original Latin, his version reproduces the same text as Doroteo's, with only a few slight and syntactically insignificant variations. This is a comparison between the incipits of the two texts. You have Doroteo on the left side and Rasario on the right side. And as you can see, I emphasized in bold the words or expressions that look exactly the same. And as you can see, it doesn't change much. Most of the text reads exactly the same. So we can imagine in this case Rasario having Doroteo's version before his eyes, next to him, and changing slightly some passages or word choices. And in this case, you have another passage from one of the central books in which Rasario reproduces exactly the same text as Doroteo. It doesn't change a comma. And this is not the only instance in which this happens. So far from being a new translation, Rasario's work offers what can be considered at most a minor reworking of Doroteo's version. The nature of the modifications introduced into the text, which are all merely stylistic and never really bring about a significant change in the structure or in the philosophical terminology of the work, makes it evident that Rasario did not undertake any investigation into the manuscript tradition, as he claims to have done, and that his work simply consisted of a little adjustment of Doroteo's text. And it's not just that. Rasario's version also reproduces the very same layout featured in Doroteo's printed edition, with even the very same marginal notanda appearing in most cases in the same place. These are the two editions. Again, Doroteo on the left and Rasario on the right. The font are different, but the pagination, the layout is exactly the same, and the marginal annotation, the notanda, are exactly the same, and they are placed in exactly the same place. So on the left you have vide consimile in simplicio in prologo, and here Rasario vide consimile in simplicio in prologo, vide simplicium, idem in tertio libro, idem in tertio libro, again and again. You can follow both texts over and over, page after page, and the layout is exactly the same. I contend that an explanation can be found by looking at the next steps in the printing history of Rasario's version. Rasario's translation, I tracked down all the prints, of course, and Rasario's translation was issued again 3 more times, as you can see, in 1559, 1569, and 1581. Of these 3, however, the 1569 publication was not simply a reprint of the previous editions, for it featured a new translation, remarkably different from the one we just saw. Also, this new translation was published not by Girolamo Scotto, but by a different printer, Vincenzo Valgrisi, with whom we shall see Rasario collaborated extensively during his lifetime. In the preface to his new edition, Rasario writes the following. He says, "Having translated the commentary on the first 4 books of this work into Latin a decade ago, I have thus far refrained from publishing it openly. As a certain friend of mine, amicus quidam meus, had given me the great hope that he would send me the remaining 4 books, which are not extant. However, seeing that this has been delayed far longer than one could reasonably wait, I have been compelled, at the urging of many, to bring this portion to light." So this, for a Philoponus scholar, is really a remarkable piece of information. Rasario is saying here that a friend of his was able to locate the lost books of Philoponus' commentary and promised that he would give them to him to be published. Surprised by these words, I started to look more into the issue and soon find out that Rasario was a well-known figure to early 20th century editors of the Corpus Medicorum Graecorum project. As some of the Corpus editions were being prepared, Rasario was discovered to have forged the Greek text of Galenic works that had gone lost, to have claimed their discovery, and finally to have translated them into Latin. He did so with at least 5 works by Galen: his commentary on Hippocrates De Moribus, his commentary on Hippocrates Epidemics 2, Epidemics 6, his commentary on Plato's Timaeus, and his commentary on the De Alimento. The case of Galen's commentary on Hippocrates De Moribus is especially noteworthy. The commentary is mentioned by Galen in his De Libris Propris and in other works as well. During the Middle Ages, the commentary was translated first into Syriac and then into Arabic. The Syriac version was subsequently lost, while only fragments of the Arabic survive. The commentary suddenly reappeared in the Renaissance, when Rasario published his Latin translation, both in the 8th volume of his complete edition of Galen of 1562-63 and in a standalone edition printed in 1562, both published by Valgrisi, the printer of the new Philoponus translation of 1569. This is the 1562 standalone edition of Galen's commentary on the De Moribus. In the preface of this standalone edition, dedicated to his friend and collaborator Niccolò Sammicheli, Rasario recalls the story of the work's discovery, and I'm sure it will ring a bell. It says, "For when all the extant works of Galen had already been printed, and 3 of Galen's commentaries on Hippocrates De Moribus," he refers to the 3 books comprising the commentary, "were brought to me, I was uncertain whether I should translate them or not. Many things deterred me: the difficulty and scope of the task, especially since in the early days I had only a single copy available, which was incomplete, with numerous sections missing or abbreviated, and not particularly old either. However, not long afterward, an extremely ancient manuscript, Vetustissimus Liber, came into my hands. At that point, I could no longer resist the idea that I ought to comply with your request, to whom I owe so much, as well as the demands of others who were urging me to do the same." The 2 manuscripts of the commentary mentioned here by Rasario are still extant today. They are both housed at the Bibliothèque Nationale de France. This is one of them, the Coslen 163, and the other one is the Supplementus Grecus 2. They're still extant, and they bear marginalia written by Rasarius. And as in this case, you have the text, and all these marginal annotations are by Rasario himself. We now know that they were produced on demand only in 1560. So they were not at all antiquissimi libri. They were produced on demand only in 1560 by Andreas Darmarius, a professional scribe who was also in the business of producing and selling manuscripts. It was only in the 20th century that the first suspicions on its authenticity arose. When Karl Kalbfleisch, who was in charge of preparing the critical edition of for the Corpus Medicorum Graecorum, reported that the commentary was a Renaissance forgery. Years later, in his investigations into the history of the text and the reception of the Hippocratic treatise on humors, Karl Deichgräber provided philological evidence and identified the forger in Rasario. More recently, attention has been paid to the making of the forgery. It was demonstrated that Rasario put the commentary together by combining quotations from Galenic works, mostly taken from Oribasius. Recent studies have also shed light on the actual strategy adopted by Rasario. He first wrote a Latin version of the commentary intended for publication in print, and then translated it back to Greek. And this is the version that is preserved by the manuscripts, like this one. We are now, I believe, better positioned to appreciate the assertions made by Rasario in the preface of his 1569 translation of Philoponus' commentary, and to make sense of his allusion to an unnamed friend of his, amicus quidam meus, who had apparently put his hands on the lost books of Philoponus' work and was willing to pass them on to Rasario. It seems fair to say that Rasario may have at some point planned, and probably was still planning, to manufacture the last 4 books of Philoponus' commentary and to publish them in Latin translation, just as he did with Galen. On a hypothetical level, this would explain why, in the first version of his translation, he programmatically refrained from providing an entirely new translation, limiting himself to a mere restyling of Doroteo's version. In any case, given that Rasario was about to embark on the Galen's Opera Omnia project, he probably preferred to postpone the task to a later phase, a phase in which he would be able to incorporate the lost portions of the work as well. The fact that in 1569 Rasario still mentions the story of the existence of the lost books of Philoponus, even though he does not include them in his translation, may be explained on the grounds, I think, of 2 different yet not mutually exclusive reasons. The first is that since the time of the first version, he may have talked about the existence of these books with his friends and peers, possibly with some publishers too, so that now he feels the need to explain why, after so many years have passed, he never accomplished the task of editing and translating those books. And the second reason is that he didn't want to rule out the possibility of editing and translating those books in the future, so that he thought it appropriate to hint at that possibility, suggesting his readers that he might still be able to obtain them. Now, we should refrain from seeing in Rasario simply a plagiarist and a forger. He was a very skilled scholar with an outstanding command of classical languages, and his forgeries are actually a clear witness to this. In addition to Galen and Philoponus, he translated into Latin a vast corpus of ancient and medieval Greek sources, including Xenocrates, Alexander of Aphrodisias, Soranus of Ephesus, Ammonius, Oribasius, Georgios Pachymeris. As a foremost representative of the so-called medical humanism of the 16th century, Rasario made a significant contribution to the recovery, diffusion, and systematization of the Galenic corpus, as many of you know. He was the promoter of the most complete collection of Galen's works in the early modern time, the 1562-63 10-volume edition, published again by Valgrisi. Designed to compete with the Giunta edition, appeared in 1541-42. Rasario's collection featured 100 works, no fewer than 60 of which were translated by Rasario himself. In the edition, Rasario also questions the division into classes of Galen's writings that was followed by previous editions, and proposed a new ordo instead. He made an effort to improve the quality of poorly transmitted texts by relying on previously neglected manuscripts, and to fully reconstruct fragmentary works through extensive explorations of the indirect tradition. But, of course, he was also a very ambitious and opportunistic man who strove to establish himself as a leading figure in the medical and scholarly panorama of the time. In terms of his 1569 translation of Philoponus, from the textual point of view, this does feature a different rendering in comparison to his earlier edition. And this is the passage that we saw earlier, the passage in which, in the first edition, Rasario followed Doroteo verbatim. This is the same passage which we saw reproduce Doroteo's text ad litteram. So in the 1569 edition, which you have on the right side here, you can see that the rendering is significantly different. So in this case, it does actually provide a new translation. For the moment, I can't really tell whether this new version was based on the scrutiny of additional manuscript witnesses of the work, although I'm more inclined to see in it a substantially restyled rendering rather than a retranslation proper. As some traces of Doroteo's version can still be spotted here and there, and I'm not going into detail on this now, Rasario probably simply revised his older translation, improving the style and making the text look less like Doroteo's. In conclusion, let me say that the recovery and translation of Philoponus' commentary on the physics in Renaissance Italy offer a revealing case study of how ancient philosophical texts were reintroduced, reshaped, and reinterpreted in the early modern world. From the pioneering efforts of Cristoforo Buondelmonti and Niccolò Niccoli to the editorial enterprises of Trincavelli, Doroteo, and Rasario, the work's transmission traces the intertwined histories of manuscript culture, humanist scholarship, and the role of printing. The survey of extant codices underscores the decisive role of Byzantine scholars and 15th century Italian humanists in reconstituting the text, while the analysis of Latin translations exposes both the ambitious and the limitations of 16th century philology. Rasario's oscillation between imitation and invention, culminating in his alleged plan to fabricate the lost books, epitomizes the intellectual audacity of a period eager to recover antiquity's lost wisdom at almost any cost. Ultimately, the Renaissance rediscovery of Philoponus reveals not only a renewed engagement with Aristotelian natural philosophy, but also the emergence of a new scholarly consciousness, one that balanced reverence for the ancient world with a bold drive to reconstruct and complete it. And thank you very much for your attention.